September 1st, 1969, Sheffield, Massachusetts. A 10-year-old boy named Thomas Reed was riding home with his family, which consisted of his younger brother, Matthew, mother, Nancy, and grandmother, when the family would run into what would become known as the Berkshire UFO Incident. According to Thomas, as the family were crossing a bridge, they looked up into the sky to see a disc-shaped object hovering in the air. Thomas would actually describe it as a white orb that was bigger than a football field. The family, obviously terrified, continued driving down the road, but the lights seemed to follow them. That's when his brother would spot a second one to the right. This one was a round sphere, hovering silently over the nearby fields. The car was then surrounded by 3 objects, 2 spheres, and a disc, which formed a triangle, and the vehicle was engulfed in light, and they were taken aboard a UFO. A few minutes later, the entire family would wake up back in their car. The vehicle's lights were off along with the ignition, and his mother and grandmother mysteriously had switched seats. Although, according to him, they had lost 3 hours of time, and all they remembered was being in something like an enormous warehouse. It's here that Thomas was placed on a metal table and began to hear the frantic voices of his mother and brother. And while all that sounds crazy, Thomas did go on to take a lie detector test, which recorded he was telling the truth. But this was only the first of several strange encounters that would play out this day. Actually, 40 different residents reported sightings from that night. Not far from the Reed abduction, a 14-year-old girl named Melanie Kirchdorfer was going to the lake with her family when they began backing into a parking spot and a bright light engulfed their car. Everyone began to panic. Luckily though, the light left them alone and went away, but her father, despite Melanie's pleas, decided to chase it. The only thing she would remember after this was being levitated and ending up on a ship, while another witness, a Tom Warner, would claim to have seen Melanie on this same craft, even though she didn't see him. In fact, all she remembered was being in a room with several other children, and they all began to disappear one by one, and she was woke up later on where she sat at the lake by herself, and she was forced to walk home. Tom, on the other hand, remembered being laid down at the other end of the family's property. But speaking of this 10-year-old Tommy Warner, who, as you just seen, was also abducted, his experiences began when he was playing next door with some other kids, and he began hearing a voice inside his head telling him to go home now. And Tommy was a religious kid, and he believed it was God telling him or warning him to get out of there. So he took off running, only for Tommy's friends, or in some accounts, his babysitter, to see him vanish into thin air, and he did not reappear for 7 minutes, in which time he believed he was transported to a UFO where he then seen Melanie before he was beamed back down to the ground. While 42-year-old Jane Green would also claim on her drive home she had seen a huge bright light in front of her car. She stopped, along with numerous other drivers who seen the craft at eye level before it proceeded to fly off. This was 4 different encounters between people who had no connections, and it has went on to become an iconic part of this area. But there's one big issue with all this. Despite these alleged encounters, not one police report was filled out that night, nor did it appear in newspapers, although the local radio station did receive numerous calls. Unfortunately, none of these were recorded. The radio host, however, a Tom J., claimed that people called in telling him about seeing the UFOs, and then Tom himself called the police. To add more doubt to the claims, Thomas and Matthew, the 2 brothers from the most widely known encounter from this incident, had made similar claims years before this. Supposedly, the 2 were abducted into a UFO just 3 years prior to these events in 1966, while they were also abducted again in 1967 before being dropped off in their driveway. However, this is one of those bizarre ones where quite a few people actually believe something had happened that day, especially since there were allegedly 40 other reports of strange lights in the sky. But most people seem to think all the action with the unidentified aircraft and lights really comes down to the testing of military aircraft, although the military has denied that they had anything in the area that night. Likewise, it still would not explain the abductions. Others speculate that maybe this was a real extraterrestrial encounter. And finally, it may be nothing more than mass hysteria. If I were to ask you, what was the first UFO abduction? A lot of you might bring up Betty and Barney Hill, or maybe those of you who have watched the Obscure series might even note the segment we did about old abductions that were said to have happened in the late 19th century. But could there be ones even older than that? That brings us to our story, which starts on November 15th, 1572, Kreisbuhl, Switzerland, at a farming village in the foothills of the Swiss Alps, when a 50-year-old farmer, Hans Buchmann, would wake up, put on his wool overcoat and mittens, get his walking stick, and exit the home. The poor family, which consisted of him and his wife and 2 teenage sons, always seemed to be in debt, as Hans had taken several loans to make ends meet, and he was desperate to get his head above water financially. And just by chance, this year's crop had done really well, and it, along with the money he had put back, was finally enough to pay off his debt. So on this unseasonably beautiful morning, one with no snow, he took off down the road to go the 4 miles to finally pay off his loans. The route, unfortunately for Hans, mostly went uphill and through forested terrain, and although this morning had started off as a beautiful day, the temperature was dropping. Actually, it had been dropping over the past few days, but at least he didn't have to deal with the snow at this point. What would happen next is pretty crazy, because this walk, which should have taken 2 hours each way, would keep Hans away from home for almost 3 months. And unfortunately for him, he never told his family exactly where he was going, maybe out of the shame of owing so much money. So where had he gone? That's where it gets interesting. It would be 2 weeks later when Hans would wake up with a splitting headache. He took a look around and seen he was curled up against a stone wall of an alleyway of some city unknown to him, and seemed very strange. He also immediately noticed he was dirty and scruffy. His hat, mittens, overcoat, and walking stick were all gone. Now he was wearing a ragged shirt and loose pants. He walked out into the street, asking everyone, "Where am I? What city is this?" But they all ignored him. I mean, I kinda get it, since he probably came off as an unkempt crazy person, or a drunk beggar, possibly from a different city. Now, as you may have noticed, I stated he had awoken 2 weeks later. But how did he know this? That is because Hans soon realized there were a lot of men, women, and children out on the street going somewhere. They seemed to be following the ringing of church bells to attend Mass. He soon put it together that it was St. Andrew's Day, which was 2 weeks after he had left. Now he was really confused. Finally, he seen a soldier, someone who looked like he had some authority, so he went to speak to him. Hans would say, "Sir, my name is Hans Buchmann. I was traveling to my native city of Sempach, but seem to have lost my way. What city is this?" Hans could not believe his ears when the soldier responded, "This is Milan. You are a long way from Sempach." And he wasn't kidding. It was about 160 miles away, about a week's worth of walking. How did he start off on a 2-mile walk to pay off a debt and end up on the other side of the Alps? He had no idea. Now, luckily for Hans, the soldier who had told him this could only speak to him because he was a foreign mercenary who had come to work from Milan and just happened to be Swiss. He, along with other mercenaries, helped get Hans back on his way home, which he finally reaches in February of 1573, some 3 months after he left. And he looked pretty bad. His head was swollen, he had lost all of his hair, and was basically unrecognizable. When he came back to his family, he was surprised to learn that his 2 teenage boys had set out on the same trail he had taken that day and looked everywhere for him, but all they found was his coat, hat, mittens, and walking stick, which were laying by the roadside at the edge of the forest outside of town. And when they actually went into town, only a few people had stated they had seen him and that he had stopped to have a drink at a tavern, but after that, there were no more sightings. They began to suspect that Hans's cousin, Klaus Buchmann, who had feuded with the family for years, had murdered him, but he ended up being interrogated by authorities and had his property searched and obviously found no signs of Hans. The story was intriguing enough that the local chronicler, which were all over towns in Europe at that time, and the reason we have this account, would go to question Hans about what had happened that day. He would even be interrogated by a local magistrate who began to suspect some kind of foul play or a trick by Hans. Maybe it was all some kind of plot to frame his cousin Claus. Now what's interesting here is we don't know exactly what the debt was over, but since he was spotted at that tavern, it's likely that he had a beer tab that had just gotten really out of control. But that's speculation. What is known is Hans stopped at the home of the man that he owed the money to, a man who owned another bar. But he was not there, which is how Hans ended up at another pub. It's at this point the story gets a little suspect, as Hans told the magistrate he didn't remember how much he had drunk, but it wasn't much. He then left the tavern a few hours later, right before sunset, and decided to go back home and pay his loan back at another time. And it's here, right on the forest trail on the outskirts of town, that he would hear a loud buzzing sound. He looked into the sky to see a bright light, while the buzzing sound began to increase and took on the noise of a swarm of bees, which engulfed him and started moving him towards the light into the sky. Hans recalled that was the last thing he remembered until he woke up 2 weeks later in Milan. The whole thing is strange and really matches up with descriptions of modern day abductions. But what really happened? Well, let's start with the obvious. Was this the first recorded alien abduction ever? It seems very similar to what abductees report today, and it could also explain how he ended up in Milan with a swollen head and no hair, as well as a loss of time. Interestingly, the chronicler of this story had his own theory. He stated he believed Hans was kidnapped by a fairy, which was a very popular folklore explanation in those days. There's also been the proposal that Hans experienced a time slip or dimensional shift, which accounts for the missing time and his arrival in Milan. But let's get to the more mundane theories. It's possible his disorientation may point to some kind of psychotic episode, or even that he simply drank too much and for whatever reason ended up in Milan after going on a big bender, and then he needed a good excuse to tell everyone when he arrived back home, while the swelling in his head could have just been from an infection. Or if that buzzing sound had really been a bee nest, then it may have just been from stings, although I think both of those are a long shot. Finally, a very possible theory is hypothermia. The temperature had been dropping, and it's especially cold that time of the year in the Alps, and he may have not even realized how cold it was, especially if he was drunk. It could have explained why he discarded his coat and gloves, which people suffering from hypothermia tend to do. And then once he collapsed, somebody coming by could have seen him and taken him in and started nursing him back to health, possibly while they were on the road to Milan themselves. Maybe merchants who began to think that Hans was never going to wake up, so they just dumped him off in that alley in Milan and left him there. December 9th, 1965, around the American-Canadian border is where this mystery would first get its start. It happened around the late evening when residents of 6 states, as well as Ontario, Canada, would witness a large brilliant fireball fly through the sky, with most of the reports coming from Detroit and Windsor, Ontario areas. But this would not be the only thing witnesses seen, because as the fireball blazed through the sky, hot metal debris fell to the ground in parts of Michigan and northern Ohio, starting grass fires. Meanwhile, sonic booms were reported in Pittsburgh, before finally residents of a small village known as Kecksburg, sitting about 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, would report seeing wisps of blue smoke, vibrations, and a thump that might have something to do with some of the witness reports that stated they seen something crashing from the sky into the woods. Soon after this crash, the Army ordered the area to be sealed off, so the state troopers did just that, and then waited on U.S. Army engineers and potentially civilian scientists. Meanwhile, Air Force personnel, along with the state troopers, searched over the forest and reportedly found nothing. This would only be confirmed by the newspaper the next day, which had the headline that read, "Searchers failed to find object." And just like that, the whole thing was over. Yet, the mystery was just beginning, because this led to several rumors about what exactly it was that fell. And more specifically, was it extraterrestrial? At the time, authorities tried to look for more plausible explanations, such as a plane crash, satellite debris, a meteor, or perhaps even an errant missile test. Astronomers in particular were quick to push the meteor theory, while the Department of Defense eventually came out and stated it was natural phenomenon. Astronomers, however, would continue to research the fireball and soon established a general path that it had taken. They stated the fireball was spotted in Detroit around 4:44 p.m., which was based on 23 reports from pilots who had seen it. Likewise, shock waves were recorded hitting southwest of Detroit as it passed through the atmosphere. Then it flew on through the area, going northwest to southeast, and ended near the western area of Lake Erie, although other scientists believed it actually landed on the northwestern shore of Lake Erie. This would be the basic story for decades, although there were a ton of conspiracies around the story that never went completely away. And there's probably a good reason for that, because in December of 2005, just before the 40th anniversary of what went on to become known as the Kecksburg Incident, NASA would release a statement which stated experts had examined metal fragments taken from the Kecksburg Incident all those years ago and determined it had actually came from a Soviet satellite that entered the atmosphere and broke up. Unfortunately, these findings had been lost sometime in the 80s, but what they said was quite possible, because just 12 hours before the crash, at around 3:15 a.m., the US Space Command claimed the Venus-bound Soviet Cosmos 96 probe re-entered the atmosphere and crashed in Canada. So it's possible a fragment continued on to Kecksburg. As you can imagine, the people really interested in this story, especially those that believed it was extraterrestrial, did not take this news well. That's when a UFO investigator, backed by the Sci-Fi Channel, Leslie Kean, would sue NASA under the Freedom of Information Act over the lost records. He would go to court for a couple of years, and NASA would finally agree to search for those records, only after being ordered to by the judge. That's when the NASA Public Liaison Officer testified that 2 boxes of papers from the time of the Kecksburg Incident were missing, although NASA claimed that was not unusual, citing the fact that the original tapes from the moon landing were also lost. But that's when speculation switched to the thought that NASA never had these documents. In fact, the people that investigated the site, as you may have heard me mention, were later identified as Air Force personnel, and for some reason, it wasn't unusual for military personnel in civilian clothes to identify themselves as NASA in the 1960s. But does that even matter? Not really. In fact, even NASA in recent years has went back on their theory that it was a Soviet satellite, now stating the trajectory was too steep to have been a man-made craft, more or less implying whatever fell was of a natural source. Regardless, this hasn't stopped decades of speculation about things of a more extraterrestrial nature. In fact, in 1990, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries would cover the incident, and they suggested that it was a UFO crash. They based this on the accounts of local residents who stated they had found an object in the woods shaped like an acorn, about 7 foot wide and 10 feet long with a bronze color. There were no visible doors, windows, rivets, or seams, and on the outside of the craft, it had writing which resembled Egyptian hieroglyphics. Interestingly, the Sci-Fi Channel in their documentary would interview another resident who confirmed the story of the vehicle after claiming he had seen it hauled out of the forest on a flatbed truck by men wearing hazmat suits, as well as stating that military personnel made civilians and reporters leave the area when they tried to get close. This acorn shape has also prompted others to speculate that the craft was actually an attempt to create a top-secret Nazi weapon known as Die Glocke, or the Bell. This was supposed to be a wonder weapon capable of time travel being worked on in the early 1940s by the Nazis, and then research was taken over by the US, who kept up the research until the 1960s when this thing crashed. However, most scholars state the Nazi Bell is nothing more than a hoax, or urban legend. Others, though, have went along that line of thinking and suggested the whole thing was a secret military experiment that failed spectacularly and then was covered up. Apparently, a local radio reporter, John Murphy, was one of the first ones to arrive and claimed to have even taken photos of it, only to have it confiscated by the military. He would die a few years later in a suspicious hit-and-run accident. Today, most people believe the Kecksburg Incident was indeed a Soviet spy satellite, and more than likely, part of one which crashed and was then collected by the US and studied It may have even been a film canister from the satellite, which broke off and crash-landed in Kecksburg. Likewise, it may have been a US satellite that crashed, or a US satellite which had a part break off and then crash and was covered up out of embarrassment. Of course, you will always have those that believe due to its shape, the vehicle was actually extraterrestrial, especially because of the so-called hieroglyphic markings, which some speculated was extraterrestrial writing. In the year 1830, somewhere in Latvia, a 16-year-old woman named Emilie Sagee would begin her career as a French teacher at a boarding school, and this young teacher, over the course of her career, would become known as a dedicated, diligent, and maybe most importantly of all, adored by her students. So it's somewhat weird that this same teacher, who was so loved, ended up taking over 18 different teaching positions in just 16 years, in countless schools. Was it because so many other teachers were just envious of her, or did she just get bored at the same job after being at each one for so long? Well, it seemed to be neither. Actually, the real reason was downright weird. She would take a job in 1845 at a place called Pensionet van Nieuwelke, and it's here bizarre things began to occur. At first, it was simple things, like someone walking by her classroom and seeing Emilie, and then a minute later, seeing her somewhere else. It would all be chalked up to hallucinations, or the person just being mistaken. Similar instances would continue to occur, but as time went on, people began to see Emilie in two different spots, much further apart. Like in one instance, when Emilie left a classroom to go pick some flowers from the garden, the 42 students who had been sewing would kind of be bewildered when they seen Emilie back sitting at her desk, because from the window, they could see her picking flowers in the garden. Apparently, these students were brave enough at least to go up to this doppelganger. Some of them even reached out to touch it, and although it looked just like Emilie in all regards, when they tried to touch her, their hands went through her. It felt empty. The shocked students would tell Emilie on her return, and she just seemed confused. Although she did later state that while she was picking flowers, she kept feeling an urge to go back and check on the children. The weirdness went on over the year between 1845 and 1846, and the class dwindled from 42 students to 12, due to parents pulling their daughters from school because of the strange events connected to the teacher. The school would then ask her to step down, which she sadly did, but stated that this was the 19th time, so it was hard for her to bear. When they asked her what she meant, she revealed she had taught at 18 different schools in just 16 years, which many have taken to mean the weird doppelganger had followed her that whole time. So what to make of this one? Well, it was originally published in 1860 by Robert Dale Owen in a book called Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World. He claimed to have direct testimony from one of the students, that of Julie de Goldenstaby, who was actually a member of nobility. Two other authors would repeat the same story after talking to Julie, but as far as real hard data on Emilie, well, going by her age in 1845, that of 32 years old, she had to be born around 1813, and checking records from that year in Dijon, where she was said to be born, revealed no families with the last name Sagee, although there was a baby named Octavie Sagee with the last name being spelled differently but pronounced the same way in French. It's thought that name could have been changed to protect the girl's identity, or it could be that since the baby was born to an unknown father, the name was changed to hide her illegitimacy. Another thing that might poke a hole in this story is the fact that the previous 17 jobs she was let go from, nobody ever came forward to report anything weird. It was just at this one school. Finally, this institution that she taught at, well, no one knows if it even really existed, and if it did, where exactly was it located? So was this just a finely woven folktale, or was Emilie the victim of a phenomenon called biolocation, one person being seen in two locations at once? In the year 2019, AEW World Champion Chris Jericho had just landed in Tallahassee instead of Tampa due to weather, and because of that long layover, he decided to hire a driver from a limo company he trusted who would drive his party home. So he put his bags in the back of the car, and the belt was in a gray velvet bag separate from his luggage. He then asked the driver to take them to Outback Steakhouse. However, the driver suggested Longhorn Steakhouse, which was closer, and it's here that it takes an odd turn. While at the airport, Jericho would grab the wrong suitcase. Because of this, the driver had to go back to the airport while Chris was eating and switch it with the person whose bag Jericho had grabbed. When he returned, the driver would weirdly wander around the restaurant while Jericho and his crew were eating before he slowly walked back out to the limo. 20 minutes later, the driver came back and told Jericho the title belt was missing, even though it had been placed in a nondescript bag that the driver never touched or was even told about. Jericho, understandably upset, asked how this was even possible, and then went outside to investigate. When they got to the car, Jericho noticed that something he had bought for his wife had been moved from the trunk to the back seat, and appeared to have fallen on the ground at one point. He would ask the driver if he had locked the car during the walk around the restaurant, to which the driver said no, and Jericho flipped out. It's then that the Longhorn manager told them to call the police, informing them that there was several surveillance cameras in the area. Police arrived and took statements, and Jericho was forced to leave without the brand new company's title, which costed around $30,000. Jericho would then call his boss the next morning to explain what had happened, and the company was then deciding if and how to publicly announce it. But before they could, the local police had already completed a press conference, and taking an even stranger turn, days later, Jericho would come across an article that showed the police officers parading around with the belt, taking pictures and posting them online, and this police department has still not called anyone to say they had recovered it. So where did the police get it? According to the official report, it was found by a 41-year-old Florida State University employee who said it was in a velvet bag in the middle of a turn lane. He grabbed it and threw it into his vehicle without looking at it, and took it home and posted it in the lost and found section of Craigslist, until he seen the news and then took it to the police department. However, Jericho would dispute this and said that the road this man found it on was nowhere near the Longhorn Steakhouse, nor was it near the road they took from the airport. Also, he pointed out that no one would have just picked up a bag and thrown it into their car without looking inside of it, as this man had claimed. But strangest of all was apparently the driver just happened to be at the police department when the Good Samaritan brought the belt in. Security footage was reviewed and it found nothing, and the case is still opened. In 1850, in a small village in the district of Lebus, Germany, our next incredible bizarre mystery would take place. During this year, a stranger would be spotted wandering around aimlessly along the beach with a confused look on his face. And since this was a small area, townsfolk became alarmed and soon got into contact with authorities who came to speak to him. The man was Caucasian and spoke an odd and barely understandable dialect of German. When asked about this, he would try to convey he was speaking Abramian and Laxarian. It's then they would question where he was from. The man would tell them he was from Laxaria, a country on the continent of Sacria, which was on the northern part of the world, hundreds of miles from Europe. He would then introduce himself as Jophar Vorin, and he had went in search of his brother because he had been sent to what was to them the New World, and then he pointed to Europe on the map, and obviously, the authorities were stumped. So they asked the man to indicate on the map what path he had taken to get there, but he was unable to do this. However, he would reveal his race had considerable geographical knowledge about the 5 continents called Sacria, Aflar, Astar, Oslar, and Uplar. For those of you big into stories like this, you'll immediately recognize that it sounds almost identical to the tale of the man from Taured. In that story, a man arrived in Japan in 1954 with a passport issued by the nation of Taured, which didn't exist. But what about in this case? Well, the authorities here actually had no idea what to do, so they sent him to meet the scholars from Frankfurt, who concluded his story was not that crazy and was maybe even possible. So they wanted to send him to Berlin for further studies. Unfortunately, during the journey, he would have a hysterical fit and jump from the carriage, where he would then disappear into the woods and was never found, which leads us to theories. Of course, one of the big ones has always been that this was some type of interdimensional being, and upon fleeing into the forest, he had a way to travel back to his dimension, which could explain why there was never another sign of him. Of course, many think it's just an older version of the Taured story. However, this one does have a more reliable source than the Taured story. According to a German newspaper from October 1851, the man did not jump out into the forest and vanish. Instead, he got sent to a Berlin workhouse, a place for people who could not support themselves financially and were offered accommodation and employment. And it's here he would tell the others the same stories, as well as the stories about him traveling inside giant birds and warfare that took place in the air. And it was also assumed that this so-called unknown language was really a Slavonic one, that he really just spoke backwards, giving us the most likely theory that he had a mental disorder, or possibly even amnesia from a very real shipwreck where he suffered head trauma. In September 1931, the Irvin family, consisting of James, Margaret, and their 13-year-old daughter, Vorin, would be subject to a weird mystery at their farmhouse in Cashin's Gap, Britain. The family would begin to hear scratching, rustling, and vocal noises from behind a wooden panel at their farmhouse. They at first thought it was a dog, or possibly a ferret. According to the Irvins, a creature would come out and introduce himself as Jeff. He would tell them he was a mongoose born in New Delhi in 1852. According to the 13-year-old daughter, Jeff was the size of a small rat with yellowish fur and a large bushy tail. But not only could Jeff talk, he could also sing, as well as Jeff would continue to tell them such things like he was an earthbound spirit or a ghost that had possessed a mongoose. According to the Irvings, this mongoose, or spirit, would guard their house and warn them of approaching guests and the like. He was said to have thrown stones at visitors and was even able to strike a match. He also woke the family up in the morning if they overslept. He had hands the size of big doll's hands, with 3 fingers and a thumb. Supposedly, he lived on biscuits, chocolates, sausages, and bananas that the family left for him on a saucer suspended from a ceiling, and Jeff would take the food when no one was watching. He also followed them to the market, but would remain hidden from strangers. And proving how boring life was in the 1930s, this story actually got a lot of tabloid press. Many journalists flocked to the Isle to try and see the creature. Several local residents, as well as visitors, did claim to hear Jeff's voice, and 2 people claimed to have seen him. However, no physical evidence was ever found. In 1945, James Irving would pass, and his widow and daughter would sell their home at a loss due to its reputation as being haunted. In 1946, a man named Leslie Graham would buy the home and tell the press he shot and killed Jeff. However, upon seeing the body, Vorin stated that it was not Jeff, and she would live until 2005 and would be interviewed before her passing and stated that the creature did exist and she did not make the whole thing up. There were a few investigations that looked into this phenomenon, if that's what you want to call it, and a few things were learned. For one, hair from the alleged creature was kept by the family and turned over to a biologist as proof, but was shown to be nothing more than belonging to the family sheepdog. Another thing discovered was that speaking into any of the gaps of the panels of the home, which there were many, would carry the voice to other parts of the house. And finally, Nandor Fodor, who was a psychoanalyst, lived in the home for a week without hearing or seeing Jeff, but he did conclude that he did not believe Jeff had been a deliberate deception or hoax. Instead, he believed that Jim Irving was dealing with a split personality and possibly was able to convince the family that Jeff did exist. However, a reporter that was covering the story would actually catch daughter Vorin making the noises, and when she realized she was busted, Jim started trying to convince him that it came from somewhere else. Most skeptics now believe the hoax was created by Vorin and that she may have used ventriloquism, and that her family hyped it up due to paranormalist and tabloid reporters. But what do you think? August 31st, 1965, a couple of newspapers in South America, specifically Peru and Argentina, would publish a very odd story. According to these articles, on August 29th, 2 men who were cited as anonymous were driving down a desolate part of the highway in southern Peru, about 12 miles away from Arequipa, when these men, who were later identified as Antonio Chavez Bedoya and Julio de Romana, would come upon one of the most bizarre entities we have covered yet. It just appeared in the road, which forced the driver to swerve the car to avoid hitting it. From the side, they stopped to get a better look at this thing. which they described as a blackish strange being, a Martian, that resembled a tree shrub. It apparently stood about 2.5 feet high and had a single golden eye nestled on what they thought was its head. The being was also being orbited by some strange gold and silver strips, sorta like tinsel you put on a Christmas tree. As the men stood there taking it all in, they soon noticed that it actually had more than one eye. It had many smaller eyes located all over its body. It's this description that would later on draw comparisons to a living Christmas tree. Now this weird one kinda ends abruptly, as all we have left of the account is the creature's presumed exit, because the two men would then go on to say right after this, they seen a flying saucer soar over the vehicle, and that very same night, there had been several other eyewitnesses call in to report seeing a UFO which had been flying low to the ground. Some of these reports came as far away as 12 miles, but that abruptness that I mentioned comes in now because that's all to the story. It's never followed up on if the men actually seen this weird tree-like alien board this aircraft or not, so we're left with the assumption that it did. Although it's possible the men were scared of this alien-like tree and left before actually seeing it get on the saucer, but they did see it flying over on their way out. We really just don't know. Also, this is the one and only report of the Arboreal Abomination. It has never been spotted again, and we still don't know what it was to this day. Before the theories, of course, you get the paranormal ones that are going to say it was some kind of bizarre alien life form, which was proven by the UFO that flew by right after, and that the shrub-like appearance was not actually alien at all, but more like an extraterrestrial probe or robotic device used in exploration. The cryptid side of the argument is that it's some kind of plant-animal hybrid that is currently not understood by science. For the more mundane theories, it's very possible that the two men were on drugs, or had been drinking, or were in some state of altered consciousness, maybe even triggered by fatigue, and they basically hallucinated the whole event. Or it could be the classic hoax. One night in 1969, Leary, Georgia, a man was preparing to give a speech at a meeting of a club when one of the guests would call for him to come over to a window and look outside. And the man, curious, walked over and looked, and there it was in the sky, a bright white object, almost as bright as the moon. It began moving towards them, but stopped and hovered over a line of pine trees in the distance. It's then this object began to change colors from white to blue, then red, then back to white, before it disappeared in the distance. And in what would seemingly just be another UFO story, this one stands out for one reason. The man that witnessed it, his name was Jimmy Carter, the future president of the United States. Now at the time this occurred, Carter was only a member of the Georgia State Senate, but he had declared his intent to run for governor of Georgia, and it wouldn't be until 4 years later, in 1973, that, after he was governor, he filed his official report, after the International UFO Bureau had heard the story and asked him to. In the report, Carter would state whatever he had seen was emitting the light by itself, and it wasn't the reflection of light off of something on the ground. Likewise, he did not think it was a solid object, suggesting he was intangible, maybe taking on a gaseous form, which is usually reported in ghost sightings. Carter would then state that it was also witnessed by around 10 to 12 people, and likewise, it remained viewable for about 10 to 12 minutes, and none of them could explain what it was they had just seen. Now, as you may have noticed, I did not list an exact date, and that's because that is a source of confusion. When Carter filed his report 4 years after the incident, he stated that it was in October of 1969, but when investigators began digging through the records of those club meetings, they soon realized that the meeting had taken place earlier that year, on January 6, 1969, not in October. Likewise, Carter had made a regular report of this meeting with the club, and he cited a date of January 6th. Yet, nowhere in that report does he ever mention that there was a UFO. So more than likely, Carter was mistaken, and the events did take place in January. So with that being squared away, what the heck did Carter and this other dozen people see? Well, once Carter began running for president, you know the media was going to run down every story possible, and that's what they did here. According to one source, they were able to trace down all the attendees at that meeting some 7 years after the events, and called every one of them, and only one of them remembered seeing anything. That man's name was Fred Hart. He recalled it being a little blue light, or something like that, moving around in the sky. He suggested that it may have been a weather balloon, but he had actually forgotten all about it until they called him. All of the other attendees stated they could not remember, or if it did happen, he was viewed as insignificant. Now interestingly, Carter stated while he did file a UFO report, he only did so because technically it was unidentified, but he didn't think it was of extraterrestrial origin. And with his training in the Navy, he had a pretty good understanding of physics, and he did not think it was an alien craft. So with that, what did he see? Well, the earliest theory put forward came from ufologist Robert Schaefer, who suggested that what Carter really seen was the planet Venus. This will be backed up by other ufologists who began calculating exactly where Venus would have been in the sky on that very night. However, Carter himself would dispute this in 2007 in an interview with the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast. He said he knew it wasn't Venus, as he was an amateur astronomer and had viewed Venus before. Furthermore, he said as a scientist, he did not believe it was an alien craft at all, and instead was probably some kind of military aircraft. He would go on to note that it did not make a sound like you would hear from a helicopter, although it sort of moved like one. He also stated he didn't believe aliens ever visited Earth and that he didn't know of any government cover-up. And he also shot down the long-held rumors that the CIA refused to give him information about UFOs. The same podcast would receive a letter from the Carter family in 2016, one they had received from someone else and they had just forwarded. Basically, it came from a man named Carl, who claimed that in the 1960s and 70s, he worked on an Air Force project that studied the upper atmosphere using releases of glowing chemical clouds launched by rockets in Florida. And in this project, they had to always launch them after sunset or before sunrise to be able to view them. He felt that this is what Carter had seen, as those clouds often glowed blue or green and then became red. They would also appear bright and about the size of the moon. Of course, this was just some random person that sent this letter to the Carter family, and none of this has been verified, but it's very possible this is the explanation. But it's worth pointing out, Carter pledged to tell the truth about UFOs once he became president, but after getting elected, he backed off, citing national security concerns. One could take this to mean that it had more to do with his secret weapons program, or possibly that he was told to hush about UFOs and aliens. In fact, there's this long-held story that the CIA informed Carter about the truth of UFOs and aliens, and he began to weep because it challenged his deep Christian faith. Of course, none of this can be verified either, and it's long been held as fiction. So this next cryptid mystery is one of the more interesting ones because so much of it is documented to have really happened. In 1848, Quartermaster Major Henry Wayne would go to the War Department with a peculiar suggestion. He wanted the Secretary of War to consider importing camels to the Southwest Territory, which was greatly expanding. Now, this wasn't the first time this was proposed. As far back as 1836, Major George G. Crossman would also recommend to Congress that the Army should use camels for the problems of crossing the desert. It was thought that camels could be used to carry at least twice the amount of weight as horses and mules. It was also suggested that camels could carry mail and that fast camel passenger trains could be developed to run from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. And by 1854, the Senate passed a bill to appropriate $30,000 for the camel experiment. However, although the camels were well suited for travel in the Southwest, they were terribly unpopular with the soldiers. They had a bad habit of frightening smaller livestock, and they were giant, goofy, and smelly. They also had a tendency to wander off during the nights. The Army would use the camels until the Civil War broke out 3 years later, and here's where the story kinda deviates. Some camels were supposedly released during a battle as a distraction. Others would be sold, while others would just straight up released into the desert. Whatever the case, the Army was done with the camel experiment. Though the Camel Corps was abandoned, they would roam the desert for decades, but they were not limited to this area, as sightings stretched from Iowa to California. and even as far north as British Columbia. And this will lead to a number of legends and tales about the camels. The most famous is the one known as Red Ghost, which is deserving of a video unto itself. But fast forward to 1941, Douglas, Texas, and the last official sighting would occur when the entire body of a camel was witnessed at a relatively close range. But sightings were still sporadic in the 60s and would occur all the way up to the early 2000s, particularly in the 1980s when a series of highly credible sightings took place in Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Texas. Sightings are generally made by witnesses who are traveling down roads that run through desert areas when they just happen to catch a glimpse of what appears to be a camel calmly strolling off into the distance. Other times, they come from those exploring the desert on foot. There's also reports that have been made by those who have spent the day hiking, treasure hunting, or exploring areas around one of the many abandoned mines in the American Southwest. And now for the mystery. It's been decades since the last real army camel died, but stories about camels trekking along the southwestern desert persist. So what are these people seeing? Are these ghosts? Or could there be camels that somehow survived and reproduced and are still traversing through the desert? Or are they just mirages? Or maybe just people who are telling tales to keep the legend alive? One foggy morning in the year of 1925, Moores Beach, Santa Cruz, California, the earliest crowds would begin arriving in search of fun and sun for the day. And it's these early birds that would stumble on to our next mystery. As they made their way through the fog towards the water, they seen a large shape laying in the sand. Upon closer inspection, they could tell it was the remains of a strange creature that seemed to be mangled and decomposing, yet, strangely, was still intact. The word of this weird discovery spread across town, and it brought crowds of onlookers to the beach to see it for themselves. There's only one picture, that I could find anyways, but we are left with a pretty decent description. The thing was about 30 to 50 feet in length, with a large serpentine neck that stretched about 20 to 30 feet. Its head was about as large as around as a person and sort of looked like a duck with a long tapering bill. Its body was thick and barrel-shaped, with what appeared to be elephant-like legs. It even had the ivory toenails, while it seemed to use a large, powerful whale-like tail to swim through the water. The most striking characteristic, though, was the smell. This carcass stunk very bad, as if it appeared to be in an advanced state of decay. The beachgoers had no idea what this thing was, although they had guesses. Some thought it was a plesiosaur, a marine reptile that was supposed to be extinct, while others thought it might be a creature that had never been discovered before. Thankfully, although it was 1925, news did spread quickly enough to gather the attention of a self-proclaimed naturalist who had served as president of the Natural History Society of Columbia, A. E. L. Wallace, who upon examination made a bold claim. This was indeed a genuine plesiosaur that had been preserved in glacial ice, only to thaw out and wash ashore in California. Pretty exciting, right? Except for one problem. This E.L. Wallace had no real credentials. In fact, no one was even sure if that was his real name or not. He just sorta appeared, made the announcement, and left. And to this day, no one knows who this man really was, and that's not even the mystery. However, the real legit scientists did eventually make their way to the area to investigate the creature, and they took its head and transported it back to do a more thorough examination, and they came up with the conclusion that this was nothing more than a Baird's beaked whale, a rare deep diving species that hardly anything was new about back then. These animals can get up to about 40 feet, and they are rarely seen, but going against that theory was that the carcass's strange long neck and duck-like head that did not match that of a beaked whale. There was also other features though, like some biologists noted that the creature had no teeth, as well as the skin texture did not match that of a whale. Regardless, science believed they had their answer, although debate has carried on for decades. But it really leads to our mystery at hand, because it's this creature that washed up on the shore in 1925 that would lead to the cryptid known as Bobo, because over the rest of the century, this animal, or something said to resemble it, would be spotted by multiple eyewitnesses in the Monterey Bay. Sightings appeared from all corners of it as well, sometimes from fishermen, other times from people just sailing around. The descriptions were always a bit varied, but they shared a lot of features. Usually, they were described as having a barrel-shaped body and a horse-like head, with a duck-like bill. It was even described sometimes as having a sad, almost ape-like face. One of the more famous encounters came just a decade later in the 1930s, when a sardine fishing boat came face-to-face with a 12-man crew. It apparently rose up out of the water not far from the vessel and just stared at the men. They at first thought the creature was a man, but its face was about 4 feet wide and had a long, slender neck that was about 12 feet out of the water. They even described it as a mix between a monkey and an old man with large pink grapefruit-like eyes. They stared in silence, and then the creature let out a snort and dove back beneath the waves. This quickly spread throughout the fishing community. Sightings continued, and by the 40s, it exploded in popularity in California, with tons of more reports coming in. It even become somewhat predictable, as Bobo tended to show up on calm days right before a storm blew in. It was thought it might be sensitive to air pressure changes. Others, however, thought that the beast was just basking in the sun on clear days. Regardless of which, descriptions always claimed that Bobo's stare was somewhat haunting and sometimes shook up the witnesses. The sightings died down after this though, and since the 1960s, they are somewhat rare. And that brings us to the theories. Just what was this thing? Well, the skeptical take is that it's nothing more than an urban legend, probably taken from fishermen tales, misidentifications, and hoaxes. I mean, the case in 1925 is what really kind of started the whole thing, and it's quite possible it was indeed the carcass of a beard's-beaked whale, while the sightings in the ocean were probably just whales and sea lions. Of course, some believe it might actually be a surviving plesiosaur, while others think it was just an undiscovered species of animal. You have no doubt heard of this following artifact, even if you are not a religious person. The famous Indiana Jones movie alone should ring a bell when hearing the words Ark of the Covenant. But what is it exactly? And what happened to it? The legendary artifact is said to be an ornate golden case built about 3,000 years ago by the Israelites to house the 10 Commandments. From the biblical description, it is large, about 4 feet long, 2 feet high and wide wooden chest, covered in pure gold and topped with 2 large golden angels called a mercy seat, and it was carried using poles inserted through rings on its sides. Inside was 2 stone tablets with the 10 Commandments, and according to the New Testament, it also contained Aaron's rod, which was a walking stick carried by Moses' brother, Aaron, as well as containing a pot of manna, which was some kind of edible substance, not to be confused with mana which recharges your magic points, although that might have been more handy. The ark was created according to a pattern given to Moses by God when the Israelites were encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai, and then carried 2,600 feet in advance of the Israelites on the march through the desert. When they camped, it was stored in a sacred tent called the Tabernacle. The ark would go on to be linked to several miracles in the Bible. It was said to have cleared impediments and poisonous animals from the path of the Israelites as they left Egypt. When they crossed the Jordan River, the Bible says the river stopped flowing the moment the ark bearer stepped foot in it. Many others assert when the Israelites besieged Jericho, they carried the ark around the city for a week while sounding the 7 trumpets of the ram's horn, and on the 7th day, the walls fell down, allowing an easy conquest. But even this powerful weapon could not stop the evil to come, which happened in 597 and 586 BC, when the Babylonian Empire would conquer the Israelites, and the Ark of the Covenant, which was supposed to be stored in the Temple of Jerusalem, would vanish. And in the centuries since, theologians, as well as historians alike, wonder what actually happened to it. Was it destroyed or stolen by the Babylonians? Did the Israelites just hide it, and its location was lost to time? Well, if you have heard this story before, you probably know the most famous alleged location of the Ark of the Covenant. That is, in Ethiopia. To be more specific, the town of Axum, in a cathedral called St. Mary of Zion. A story called the Keber Nagast, which is like the national epic of Ethiopia, tells us that before the Babylonians were able to destroy Jerusalem, the Ark found its way out and down into Ethiopia, where it was hidden and remains under guard to this day. How this happened is a bit mysterious. It seems that Emperor Menelik I of Ethiopia left a forgery at the temple in Jerusalem and with divine assistance was able to smuggle it out of the country and back home with him. Which sounds like a logical story, right? Well, except for, whatever reason, the church authorities have one man who is now the sole guardian of the Ark, whom changes every time that guardian dies, unless the Ark is keeping him alive forever. Regardless, this one guardian is the only person allowed to see it, which means it's impossible for an outsider to study and verify its authenticity, assuming it's even there. Which leads to the next point. British scholar and historian Edward Ollendorff claimed he actually got to examine the Ark in 1941 while he was a British Army officer. He stated that it was nothing more than an empty wooden box dated to the medieval period, so there goes that. So if it's not Ethiopia, where to look next? Let's stay in Africa, because it's here the Limba people of South Africa and Zimbabwe have claimed the Ark was carried much further south, past Ethiopia, by way of Yemen and hidden in a deep cave in the Dumgi Mountains. This comes from the fact that the Limba people have their own legend that has been passed down from their ancestors that tells of a very similar story to the Ark of the Covenant. In their version, an object called the Voice of God, that was similar to the size of the Ark of the Covenant, was carried on poles by a priest and not allowed to touch the ground. This artifact was also used as a weapon of great power, able to sweep the enemies to the side. Unfortunately, their legend also states that after the Ark was with the Limba for some time, it self-destructed. So yeah, I don't know about that one. After this, the theories are a little less known and reported, albeit maybe a little more believable. One claim is that the Ark was actually hidden in a maze of tunnels beneath the first temple of Jerusalem before the Babylonians destroyed it in 586. However, that theory cannot be tested because that location is now the site of the Dome of the Rock Shrine, which is sacred in Islam. Another theory states that the Ark was never even moved to Jerusalem until later, probably during the reign of King Josiah between 640 and 609 BC, which is further backed up by 2 Chronicles 35:3, which reads that King Josiah told the Levites to put the holy box in the temple that Solomon built and not to carry it from place to place on their shoulders like before. Of course, you also have to mention off-the-wall theories that it found its way to Rome or was taken to a faraway place like New Guinea. Some even suggest that it could have been taken to several different places by the Knights Templar, including the United States. Finally, an even crazier theory is that the Ark story was not even written until the 8th century AD, when an independent writer penned a text called Ark Narrative. It's believed that the story was then taken and put into the Bible much later on. And one last observation, assuming they do find this artifact and it fits the description, how does one determine it's the same one from the Bible? October 25th, 1974, 41-year-old oil driller Carl Higdon decided to take the day off to elk hunt at Medicine Bow National Park in Wyoming. Higdon was in for some luck that day because a group of elk would walk out right in front of him, and he quietly raised his rifle and aimed at the largest male. As soon as he pulled the trigger, he knew something odd had happened. Actually, it's what didn't happen. The rifle did not kick back, and even stranger, there was no sound of the gunshot. And if you're thinking it was a misfire, well, it wasn't that, because Carl claimed he was actually able to watch the bullet leave the barrel and soar forward so slowly that it looked like it was going through a wall of invisible jello. The bullet flew only a few meters and sharply fell to the ground, as if it had hit something invisible. Carl went over to pick up the bullet and saw it was flattened by something very strong. And if you thought that was strange, buckle in, because Carl would hear the noise of branches crunching, and he turned to see this human figure in the bushes. This being was about 6 foot tall and was wearing a skin-tight black one-piece outfit that Carl claimed was similar to a wetsuit scuba divers wear. Atop the suit was a pair of harness-like straps that crisscrossed his chest. Below that was a metallic belt adorned with a large yellow 6-pointed star. Beneath the star was an insignia Carl could not identify. It had no visible ears and its eyes were small and lacked brows. The dome of his skull was covered with incredibly coarse hair, almost like he had straw growing out of his head. Its mouth was lipless and was instead slit-like, which concealed 3 exceptionally large teeth on top and bottom. a pair of antennas, and the thing that stood out to Carl the most was its face, which blended directly into its neck. It also had a pointy, almost drill bit-like appendage sticking out of its wrist where its right hand should have been, and nothing on the left at all. The bizarre alien-like being slowly approached Carl, who was obviously frightened, and asked, "How you doing?" which the account does not record if Carl thought that was a pickup line. Instead, Carl was pretty freaked out and replied, "Pretty good." The extraterrestrial then asked Carl if he was hungry, but before he could even reply, the being sent a small clear cellophane package floating towards him which contained 4 pills. The alien said it would keep him full for the day, so Carl took one and kept the others in his pocket. The strange jawless humanoid then introduced himself as Ausso One. That's when Carl would notice a strange box-like transparent object in the sun's rays behind this creature. It had no entrance, windows, or landing gear. Ausso One, noticing Carl staring at his ship, asked Carl, "Do you want to come along?" Carl shrugged his shoulders sure, and it was at this point that time seemed to leap forward, and Carl's next recollection was of being inside a cube-like craft and being given a tour of Ausso One's home planet. It's here, 163,000 light years from Earth, that Carl seen this huge tower that had many colored lights revolving around like powerful searchlights. He would then see a group of people outside, and also told him that his race regularly flies to Earth for hunting. Carl was then scanned by some kind of device, and also told him he was not suitable for their purpose and would take him back home, which he did. Carl then found himself in a forest disoriented and frightened. He wandered around until he found his truck, and then gave a distress signal over the radio and waited for help. A search party would find him, and it turned out his truck was at the bottom of a deep forest canyon, 5 miles from where he had parked. There were no roads nearby and no tracks leading down to the gorge. When found, he was so confused that he just kept talking about the bullet. That now flattened bullet was found in his pocket and must have hit something harder than stone. The other memories came out through regressive hypnosis. The strangest of all was that the scars left from long-term tuberculosis disappeared from his lungs, as well as his kidney stones. The trip had somehow cured him. Obviously, the most common theory on this one is hoax, that Carl made it up to become famous. But one thing no one could disprove is just how Carl's truck got down in that canyon. No tire tracks, and the recovery vehicle got stuck several times just trying to get to him. In 1885, a pamphlet published entitled The Beale Papers would tell the story of a man named Thomas J. Beale. Beale, who lived during the 1800s, led a group of 30 men from Virginia to the west. At some point in the Spanish province of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, most likely an area that is today Colorado, Beale and the men would go buffalo hunting. And it's here they came across a splendid surprise, because they stumbled up onto a rich mine of gold and silver. The men would spend the next year and a half mining thousands of pounds of these metals, which they then entrusted Beale with transporting back to Virginia and hiding it in a secure location. Beale would make multiple trips to stock it in the hiding place, and then encrypted 3 messages. One was the location, the other was a description of the treasure, and finally, the names of the owners and relatives. And although the exact location is unknown, it is traditionally believed to be in Mantell, Virginia. The ciphertexts were placed in an iron box, and in 1822, Beale entrusted the box to a Lynchburg innkeeper named Robert Morris. Beale told him not to open it unless he or one of his men failed to return from their journey within the next 10 years. He did send a letter from St. Louis a few months later and promised Morris that a friend in St. Louis would mail the key to the cryptograms. However, that never arrived, and it wasn't until over 20 years later that Morris decided to look inside the box. Inside, he found the 2 letters from Beale along with several passages of ciphertext separated into 3 papers, and Morris had no luck in solving them, and he would one day leave the box and its contents to a friend. This friend, using the United States Declaration of Independence as the key for the modified book cipher, successfully deciphered the second ciphertext, which gave a description of the buried treasure, but that's as far as he got. Which brings us back to the beginning, because this friend would take the letters and text to a friend who was a publisher, James B. Ward, and they made the contents public in 1885 in a pamphlet called The Beale Papers. Now, as mentioned, The second one has already been deciphered, and according to that, the treasure's total weight is about 3 tons, which is a mix of gold, silver, and jewels with an estimated total of about $43 million today. So, is any of this legit? One early researcher in the late 1960s actually used a supercomputer to analyze the ciphers and found that while they were poorly encoded, the 2 undeciphered texts do show patterns expected of it in ciphered text and were not just a bunch of random numbers, and probably encoded as an intelligible text. But there's still a lot of doubters. One researcher claimed that the whole story had so many red flags that it indicated a hoax, while later cryptographers have claimed they had statistical characteristics which suggest they are not actually encryptions of an English plaintext. Also, why would Beale write 3 different ciphertexts for one single message if he wanted to ensure that the next of kin got their share? Especially if one decoded where the treasure was, what would be the incentive of decoding the one with the description of the treasure? Or the one of the next of kin? Analysis has also been completed on the writing of the pamphlet and compared to one of the deciphered Beale's letters, and it's shown that it's very possible it was the same person writing both. And speaking of next of kin, it appears that the third cipher is too short to list 30 individuals on. And another interesting point, why did he even take it back to Virginia? Well, the story states they didn't feel comfortable depositing the money in a bank in Santa Fe, then a Spanish town, which kinda makes sense. But why not take it back to St. Louis, where there were reliable American banks, instead of hauling it over thousands of miles of wilderness back to Virginia? In all likelihood, the entire thing was a hoax written by James B. Ward in 1885 to sell his pamphlet and make a little money, or for some other strange reason. Although if it was real, then the simplest explanation is Beale's party went and got their share of the gold, which is why none of it has ever been found. Other smaller theories is that it was a Freemason allegory that teaches its moral by not just stating it, but by having the reader pursue or be tempted to pursue an illusion. There's also the theory that the federal government, usually the NSA, broke the code and then disguised themselves as the U.S. Forestry Service and dug it up already. 1989, Miami, Florida. A 51-year-old businessman, Vince Perry, would create a company called Active Enterprises. Perry had seen several business ideas over the years, both good and bad, but it was his child that he would take inspiration from, because one day he would happen to see his son playing a bootleg game made in Taiwan that had over 40 games on it. Perry stated that all the kids in the neighborhood would come over to play it, and he, being tired of spending $50 and $60 on Sega and SNES games, was immediately hit with an idea. Why not make his own cartridge that contained over 50 games on it? 52 to be exact. So Perry would begin brainstorming on the project, and was soon meeting with the owner of a studio. It was here that he was discussing his idea to create a cartridge similar to the bootleg version his son was playing. About that time, a sound engineer named Mario Gonzalez would overhear the conversation and tell Perry that him and his buddies, Javier Perez and Albert Hernandez, were into making video games. The three had fooled around and created a Tetris clone called Megatris. Perry, who really didn't know much about video gaming, was impressed, and immediately hired the three, along with a person who has remained anonymous to this day, to create his game. Hernandez was the lead programmer, while Gonzalez composed the music, while also working with Perez and the unnamed individual on the graphics. Perry would then showcase the game, called Action 52, at an electronics show, and then claimed he had raised $5 million from private backers, and the developers, who, if you didn't remember, were just 4 random people, pretty much out of high school, with very little experience, except for tinkering with a Tetris clone, were given 3 months to complete 52 games, which is insane as it sounds. So it's no wonder why the game would be such a disaster. The cartridge's featured game was called The Cheetah Men, which was a knockoff of the Ninja Turtles. The NES version was released in 1991 and the Sega Genesis 1993. The game was critically panned and was cited as one of the worst games in video game history. It's infamous because of the poor quality and functionality, since it had tons of bugs. But the mystery here is a lost media type, because Active Enterprises was set to release their own console called Action Game Master. it was going to have its own line of exclusive games, as well as having the full compatibility to play games from the NES, SNES, and Sega, which would use a separate adapter sold in stores. It was supposed to have a 3.2-inch color LCD screen, CD player, TV tuner, built-in battery charger, and a cigarette lighter adapter for cars. In addition, there was said to be a third Cheetah Man game, an updated Action 52 game for the SNES, and another game called Sports 5. And as you may have guessed it, none of these products have ever been seen, if they ever existed in the first place. Because the company closed in 1994, the console most likely had minimal work done, outside of basic concept designs, and there are no known prototypes of the games. When it comes to UFOs and aliens, one of the more bizarre cases began in the 1960s, and in some ways, still goes on to this day. It began on February 6, 1966, in Madrid, Spain, when a Herdan Peña would claim to have had an encounter with an enormous circular object with legs and, on its underside, a curious symbol, that of 3 vertical lines joined by a horizontal bar. The 2 exterior lines curved outward at the edges, which made the pictogram resemble an alchemical sign for the planet Uranus. Most would think this would be a quickly forgotten matter, but really, it was only just beginning, because although it originally only generated a little bit of excitement, not long after this, an author in Madrid would write a book about UFOs, and this author would receive several photographs from an anonymous mailer. These photos were similar to the one that had been originally reported by Peña, which, depending on your view, either made his sighting more credible or more suspicious. And just weeks after that, it got stranger. An alien contactee, maybe the most famous one in Spain, a Fernando Sesma Manzano, became involved when he received lengthy typewritten documents which allegedly came from a spacefaring race called the Ummites. And what is an Ummite? According to the theory, there is a planet located in the constellation Virgo called Ummo, where apparently its civilization has been for decades contacting people on Earth, usually in the form of typewritten letters, which are then sent to UFO groups or UFO enthusiasts. The whole thing would soon become known as the Ummo Affair, and actually received a lot of press coverage in the 60s in France and Spain. The letters and documents received suggest the Ummite language is difficult to speak. There's only been a few completed sentences, a lexicon, a set of vocables, the vast majority which have been given in isolation. Depending on which you believe, 400 to 1,000 Ummite words have been discerned. Now, there are theories on how the language is spoken, but that really kinda doesn't have much to do with the mystery itself. However, it's important to note that over 1,300 pages of these letters have been documented, and it's possible there's a ton more out there. At least one of these letters in 1988 references close to 4,000 of these letters being produced, which then were copied and sent to several people, with estimates that there's around 160,000 pages floating around out there. The case holds a pretty unique distinction in the fact that this case isn't even taken seriously in the UFO community outside of a few ufologists inside of Spain. The photos are just too suspicious, and while the letters do show a complex language that most would think could not be hoaxed, it very well could have been. The better question would be why someone wasted so much time and energy doing this. I mean, many of the things described in the letters discuss astrophysics, unified field theory, geology, and evolution. Not all of it is accurate, but a great portion is. The mystery, of course, is who wrote these. That is currently unknown. I mean, assuming they weren't really from the Ummites themselves. However, Herdan Peña, the man who allegedly received the first letter, claimed responsibility, stating he sent the first letters to see how people would react to a fake UFO story. He also stated he had friends helping him and also created fake witnesses. But of course, there's no way they could have sent nearly 200,000 other letters later on. But it was probably done by a group of people who worked with him or just did it on their own. Regardless, it's pretty much confirmed as a hoax. I mean, why would an advanced alien society use typewriters anyways? In 1898, a Swedish immigrant named Olaf Oman, would go out and start clearing his field of trees and stumps. It was here our next mystery begins. In the small town of Solom, about 1 mile from Kensington, Minnesota, Olaf would discover a stone entangled in some roots of a poplar tree. It was near the crest of a small hill above the wetlands, lying face down at about a depth of 6 inches. The precise date this happened on is unknown, but it was most likely in August. The stone is about 31 inches by 16 by 6 and weighs about 200 pounds. One side has an inscription consisting of 9 lines of runes, while one side has 3 more lines of runes. And of note here, the trees in the area would be cut later on, and their rings were examined, and they were discovered to be 30 to 40 years old, meaning the stone had been in the ground before 1880. It's also here we get our first clue that it might have been a hoax. Olaf would claim when he first found the runes, he thought it was some kind of Indian almanac. However, Oman owned books with accounts of runes used by Scandinavians. He should have recognized these. But in his defense, it is worth noting he never tried to make any money off of this discovery. Regardless, by 1899, newspapers would start to publish stories on the stone. As far as the actual text goes, it says, 8 Goths and 22 Northmen on an exploration journey from Vinland to the west. We had camped by 2 skerries, which is a small rocky island, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out to fish one day. After we came home, we found 10 men red of blood and dead. Hail Mary, save us from evil. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships. 14 days travel from this island in the year 1362. If this stone is genuine, it would be one of the biggest discoveries in American history, as the stone basically says that the Goths, who were just Swedes, and Northmen, who were just Norwegians, reached Minnesota far from Vinland 100 years before Columbus even attempted his voyage. Just a couple of months later, in January 1899, a copy of the inscription would be sent to the University of Minnesota professor Ollis J. Breda, a professor of Scandinavian languages, who would declare the stone a forgery. He would then forward the inscription to other linguists and historians, who all agreed that it was an obvious fraud. It was soon deemed as no interest to scholars and was sent back to Oman by that March. He is said to have used it as a stepping stone. It was largely forgotten about until 8 years later, when a historian named Hjalmar Holland would obtain the stone from Oman in August of 1907. It would be his effort that would bring the Kensington stone back into the limelight. By 1909, the Minnesota Historical Society would begin its own investigation into the stone. The man that led it was a geologist named Newton Winchell, who would get a written statement by Oman himself about his account of finding the stone. He also spent time interviewing locals and investigating the actual site. He also contacted more experts in Scandinavian languages, who all declared it a fraud. One of the key issues found early on was the weathering of the description, or should I say, the lack of weathering. The inscription was sharp and easy to read, which is crazy for a stone that just laid out in the mud for 500 years. To make things even more sketchy was the time period that the stone was found, which came about during a renewed interest in the Viking exploration of America. Scholars had been looking closer at Leif Erikson's expedition to Vinland, and it was heavily discussed in the Scandinavian community. So the odds that this stone could just change the course of history being discovered during this time frame is almost too perfect. Another issue is the language of the inscription, which was deemed to be more modern than that of 14th century Nordic language should have been. But even at this point, both Winchell and Holland were too far in. They believed fully that the stone was legit. Holland would take the stone to Europe to have it studied by more runologists. They too said it was a fraud. But Holland stuck to his theory, and he could also explain what the Vikings were doing in Minnesota. He believed that the King of Sweden and Norway had sent out an expedition to find out what happened to the colonies in Greenland and Vinland. And when they couldn't find them in Vinland, they followed a trail looking for the Vikings that led to Minnesota. He also believed he knew the path they had taken. He theorized the Vikings sailed around the north of Labrador, entered Hudson Bay, and traveled along the Nelson River, leaving 10 men at the mouth of the river. They then reached Lake Winnipeg and entered the Red River. These men would then make their way to Kensington before 10 of them were killed. The survivors then etched the stone and were killed shortly later, and the 10 waiting on them at the mouth of the river either went back to Vinland or were killed as well. Holland would even take the same hypothetical route from Hudson Bay to Minnesota looking for evidence. And at Nelson River and Red River, he would come across 2 stones with drilled holes in them he believed had been used by the Vikings to tie their boats. There is also one more little bit of possible proof for the stones. That is the story of Maka Weiswan, a Dakota woman who lived on Prairie Island in Minnesota. At the age of 90 in 1935, she would tell anthropologist Ruth Lands that many centuries ago, the Dakota seen a sailboat appear on the lake one early spring. She stated, it had mastheads of carved snakes and a great figurehead with scaly body, horns, and wings, topped by a horse's head. Aft was carved a monster with a beak. The boat had 3 sails and was rowed with long oars. On each side were strung 10 shields, and there were cabins above and below. 38 sailors or warriors manned the boat. Their clothes had scales painted on them, and they wore horned headpieces. They carried spears, knives, and axes on poles. She went on to state that the strangers gave the Dakota gifts of iron tools and weapons and showed them how to use them. The natives in turn taught them how to use bows and arrows and canoes. They also had no alcohol and did not have sexual relations with the women. They stayed until the next spring and left and never came back. But as far as the stone goes, the general consensus has always been that the whole thing was a hoax, with some people claiming Omen was behind it. But considering that he pretty much ignored the stone after they said it was fake, and considering he didn't try to profit off of it, it's not likely. He seemed pretty indifferent to it altogether. So did someone else hoax it? It's possible. It is odd that the only man who really pushed for its cause was Hjalmar Holland. And even though most scholars doubt its veracity over 100 years later, there's still a good proportion of people who believe this stone is legit. If, like me, you are a fan of Coast to Coast AM, then you know where this next one is going. Coast to Coast AM is a late-night radio talk show that deals with a variety of topics, with a heavy leaning towards the paranormal and conspiracy theories. The show airs between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., and it's always been the dominant show in that time slot. But I mean, what other competition is on during those hours? However, the show is not the same as it once was. The program actually came to prominence in the mid-90s, but it was created in 1988 by a man named Art Bell. Art was a legendary radio host, and the show averaged about 15 million listeners a night in the 90s, which is insane numbers, but also because there was no alternative. This was before podcast, and no other show was really doing what Art was doing. So if you was into the paranormal, you stayed up to listen. He hosted the show until 2000, and he retired and came back a number of times, eventually selling the show, and it still airs to this day, and Art passed away in 2018. If you ask people that listened to it back then what they remembered most about it, someone would bring up the guest, who varied between legit scientists to some of the most wacky crackpots out there, or some might bring up Art's hosting style, and how you could get lost in his stories. But the thing people will bring up the most is the callers, because in addition to letting callers phone in to talk to the guest, Art had an open lines night where you could call in and talk about anything. And what made Art unique was he refused to have a call screener, so he had no idea what the call was going to be about. And believe me, this show attracted some crazies that would call in, but there were also some that have gone down as classics, such as the guy who called from a small airplane and claimed he was about to fly over Area 51, only to tell Art they were aiming something at him, and then the phone cut out. Another classic was when a guy named Mel called in and claimed he found a hole in the woods, where he was lowering miles of fishing line down into it, and it never touched ground. But the most well-remembered, and the one this mystery is about, is the so-called Area 51 caller. On September 11th, 1997, Bell would take a call from a frantic man that claimed to be an ex-Area 51 employee. As the call went on, he got more and more upset, almost crying at points. He would claim he didn't have long to tell Art everything because they would triangulate on his position soon. He would then go on about aliens being extra-dimensional beings, and that they were planning on destroying humanity, etc. But what makes this call memorable is while he is going on about all this, Art's feed starts to cut out, and then all of a sudden, the entire show goes off air. The show would go dead for about 5 seconds, and then Art came back on and explained the show's uplink transmitter had went dead for the first time in his career. On that call, fans would immediately jump to the conclusion that the government had taken the show off the air, meaning that the caller must have been legit. As far as theories go, well, as mentioned, it could have been a prank. If so, the guy's acting was tremendous. The second theory is, well, maybe Art set it up, but in his defense, he wasn't known to do that, and there's no other known examples of him setting up a skit like that. And the final theory, the whole thing was real. But I'm gonna play a clip and let you decide.
To now, Art.
But they're not doing anything.
They are not. They want the major population centers wiped out so that the few that are left will be more easily controllable.
Discharged.
I started getting...
Well, this was certainly interesting. We are now on a backup system, everybody. A backup system. And that one caller that I had on the air, I guess we were about in the middle of his transmission, his telephone call, which was one of the strangest ones I've ever had. And the entire transmitting system by satellite went down here, and we were notified we were off the air. And it would appear to be from this end and some sort of massive transmit failure. So we are now using a backup system to be on the air. And not that I would normally believe this kind of thing, mind you, but I can't help but wonder if somebody zapped us in some way. We'll find out.
This next one is a bizarre history mystery. Almost everyone knows that Nero was a Roman emperor who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned, which of course was propaganda made up by Nero's rivals, since fiddles did not exist yet. But did you know that after he committed suicide in June of 68 AD, at least 3 different men claiming to be Nero would burst onto the scene? But before we discuss these imposters, why did this even come about? Well, there's actually a few reasons. For one was the location of his suicide, which was near the villa of his former slave and confidant, Phaon, which citizens didn't typically imagine something like that from someone as prestigious as an emperor. But even ignoring that, we have the fact that Nero was denied the luxurious burial that other emperors and members of the imperial family received, and he was also denied burial at the mausoleum of Augustus where the other Julio-Claudian emperors lay. And while this was probably because the Senate hated Nero, it could have caused the average Roman, who loved Nero, to be suspicious. But maybe the reason that citizens of Rome really bought into this was because of a circulation of prophecies that said Nero would regain his kingdom in the east, possibly that it would even begin in Jerusalem. These prophecies were largely based on Nero's birth chart, which according to his horoscope said he would lose everything he inherited from his father, only to recover it back in the east. So it's easy to see where the average Roman might buy into the conspiracy that Nero had not died. As far as the imposters go, just who were they? Well, the first one appeared in the fall of 68 AD, just a few months after Nero died, or early in 69 AD during the winter. He came from Achaia, or what is today called Greece, which the real Nero was famous for his connection to, and he had visited shortly before his suicide. The man would gain quite a bit of following, mostly of adventurers, army deserters, and runaway slaves, whom he promised would find many riches if they followed him. They would then set out to sea. The group would be blown off course by a storm and landed at the island of Kythnos. From here, he supposedly built up his money by acts of piracy. He would then start to make an appeal to Roman soldiers who were on their way to Italy. It's then that Galba, the emperor who really succeeded Nero, would task someone to hunt down the imposter. It didn't take long before he was found, and Roman soldiers stormed his ship and killed him. His head would then be taken on tour of Asia and Rome. According to Tacitus, who was one of the greatest Roman historians, the whole reason this guy was believed was not due to how convincing he was, but it was more to do about how gullible the Greeks were. But that is a bit biased, because Tacitus spoke poorly of the Greeks in general, and although he didn't know much about this first imposter, he did go on to note that the imposter was either a slave from Pontus or a freedman from Italy. The second imposter, we actually know the real identity of, so this part of the mystery is solved. His real name was Terentius Maximus. The crazy thing was he actually looked like Nero, as well as singing and playing the lyre, which is what Nero really played. Since this part of the mystery has resolution, I won't go into it too much, other than to say he went to Rome's historic rival, Parthia, in an attempt to request their help in him gaining the throne in Rome. His ruse would be discovered fairly quickly, and he was ordered to be executed by the Parthian king. Finally, the last imposter we know very little about. In fact, we only have one line about him. That comes from the Roman historian Suetonius, who wrote, "When I was a young man, a person of obscure origin appeared, who gave out that he was Nero, and the name was still in such favor with the Parthians that they supported him vigorously and surrendered him with great reluctance. So considering we know nothing about him, it seems he didn't have much of an impact." June 7th, 1948. Godman Army Airfield at Fort Knox, Kentucky would receive a report from the Kentucky Highway Patrol about an unusual aerial object spotted near Madisonville. The object, which was circular, was about 250 to 300 feet in diameter and was heading west, and reports from both Owensboro and Irvington came in. At around 1:45 p.m., Sergeant Quentin Blackwell would see the object from his position in the control tower at Fort Knox. Two other witnesses would also report seeing a white object in the distance. The base commander reported that it was very white and about 1/4 the size of the moon. Through binoculars, they were able to see that it had a red border at the bottom, and it would remain stationary for about 1.5 hours. Meanwhile, other observers, just north of Ohio, would report that the object had the appearance of a flaring red cone trailing gaseous green mist, and they observed it for about 35 minutes. It then came very near to the ground, stayed 10 seconds, and climbed back at a very fast rate, back to its original altitude, around 10,000 feet high, and disappeared, estimated to be flying more than 500 miles an hour. It was then that 4 F-51D Mustangs of Seaflight, 165th Fighter Squadron Kentucky National Guard, was dispatched to approach the subject. One pilot was that of Captain Thomas Mantell. Meanwhile, Sergeant Blackwell would stay in radio communication with pilots throughout the event. One pilot's aircraft was low on fuel and quickly returned to the base. The other two accompanied Mantell in pursuit of the object. They later described it as so small and indistinct that they could not identify it. Captain Mantell would ignore suggestions that the pilots should level their altitude to more clearly see the object, and it's here we get a bit of conflicting accounts. Some of the air traffic controllers said they heard Mantell describe the object as looking metallic and being of tremendous size, while other air traffic controllers reported hearing nothing like that at all. Meanwhile, only one of Mantell's wingmen, Lieutenant Albert Clements, had an oxygen mask, and his oxygen was low in supply, so he and Lieutenant Hammond called off their pursuit at 22,000 feet. Mantell continued to climb, however. According to the U.S. Air Force, at 25,000 feet, he blacked out from lack of oxygen, and his plane spiraled down back towards the ground. He crashed at a farm south of Franklin on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. Firemen pulled him from the wreckage, his seatbelt was shredded, and his wristwatch had stopped at 3:18 p.m., the time of the crash. Meanwhile, the UFO had vanished by 3:59 p.m. This, of course, generated a huge buzz around the nation. Some people claimed it was the spacecraft that shot Mantell's fighter down when it got too close. Others speculated it was a Soviet missile. There were even rumors that Captain Mantell's body was riddled with bullets, or in some accounts, his body was never recovered, or the plane had disintegrated, or the wreckage was radioactive. However, the Air Force disputed all these. The crash would actually be investigated by Project Sign, the first Air Force research group assigned to investigate UFO reports. They would come up with a theory pretty quickly. They surmised that what everyone was really seeing was the planet Venus. Yeah, I know that sounds pretty lame. However, this was ordered to be looked at again just 4 years later in 1952. This time, they brought in an expert, that of Professor J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer from Ohio State, who stated that the Venus explanation didn't hold water because it wasn't bright enough to be seen in the sky that night. Furthermore, a considerable haze was present that night, which would have obscured the planet in the sky. Finally, Venus would have appeared about the size of a pinpoint, whereas witnesses described a large object in the sky, which takes us to theories. After the Venus explanation was dismissed, Project Sign investigators began looking at the possibility that it was a US Navy skyhook weather balloon, a suggestion that had been put forth by Hynek. A weather balloon had been seen on telescope by at least one observer in Madisonville that night, while it was also spotted by an astronomer between 4:30 and 4:45 at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. However, going against this theory was no particular balloon could ever be conclusively identified as being in the area during the pursuit. NeoDinosaurs, or maybe better known as living dinosaurs, are a cryptid that we have discussed here a few times before. Maybe most famously is Mekele Mbembe, which supposedly lives in the jungles of Africa, specifically the Republic of the Congo and Cameroon. But what if these so-called living dinosaurs exist in other places as well? That brings us to our next cryptid mystery, the NeoDinosaurs of the Amazon basin. Going back to the late 19th century, there have been many reported sightings in the area, primarily in Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. Contrary to Mekele Mbembe, which has consistent and similar reports, sightings in the Amazon vary widely and are usually generic. This is the key reason why they don't have an equivalent cryptid with a distinct name, but instead consist of scattered accounts. However, some traits are reported more often than others. Many descriptions involve a large, long-necked amphibian-like creature, followed by reports of other more varied types. One of the earliest reports came from Scientific American magazine in 1883, which detailed the killing of a giant lizard close to 40 feet long in Bolivia. The creature has short legs and claws, and its belly and lower throat appeared to be protected by scale-like armor, while the scales on its back were even thicker. Its neck was long, and its belly dragged on the ground. The tail was flattened, but most strangely, about 13 feet from the head were two smaller, but fully formed heads that resembled those of a dog. The remains were reportedly dried, preserved, and sent for study. The professor who examined them claimed that the creature was a member of a critically endangered species. He also cited small earthen basins used by indigenous people in parts of Bolivia that matched the creature's description, suggesting it was well known in the area. Another popular report comes from October 1907, when a German traveler, Franz Hermann Schmidt, along with Captain Rudolf Fling, was on an expedition in Peru. They discovered two large sets of tracks. The next day, as they continued tracking, they heard the shrieking of monkeys before the jungle suddenly fell into an eerie silence for about 10 minutes. As they turned back to a lake, they saw what they called a monster. It had a head like a tapir, with small eyes similar to an alligator's. Its neck was snake-like but rough, resembling an alligator's hide. The body was about 8 to 9 feet thick at the shoulders, with no forelegs, only heavily clawed flippers. They shot at the creature, which clumsily plunged into the water and fled. Later, while traveling upriver, they saw it again as it swam beneath their boat. They estimated it to be about 35 feet long, with 12 feet of that being its head and neck. Then there's the story of the famous explorer, Percy Fawcett himself. He reported that a trusted friend had seen a huge reptile resembling a brontosaurus on the border of Brazil and Bolivia. Later accounts include one from 1976, when a longtime guide, Sebastian Bastos, told of an encounter while his canoe was beached in the rainforest. As he stepped away, he heard a loud noise and turned back to see a large monster tearing his boat apart. Again, the creature was described as resembling a dinosaur. Bastos wisely fled, looking back once to see the animal submerge into the river. He later stated that some of his indigenous friends told him that these animals still lived in the deep pools in the heart of the jungle. Even as late as 1995, a group of geology students in eastern Brazil allegedly glimpsed two 30-foot creatures with huge bodies, measuring about 8 feet across, and equally large tails in the shallows of a river. But what are people really seeing? Could it truly be a dinosaur? The biggest theory, of course, is mistaken identity, confusion with known animals, or even outright hoaxes. There's also the possibility that these sightings describe an unknown species of reptile, and of course, some speculate that the real dinosaurs may be hiding deep within the uncharted Amazon. December 6, 1978, 11:30 p.m., Genoa, Italy. 26-year-old night watchman Pier Fortunato Zanfretta was on his routine patrol when suddenly his car's engine, lights, and radio all died at the same time. This was awful timing considering the roads were already dangerously icy. This would obviously annoy anyone, but while he was trying to figure out if his battery had died, he looked up to see 4 moving lights in the backyard where a garden sat. The garden and home belonged to a Dr. Ettore Righe, and he was the one that had hired Zanfretta to look over the property, or I should say, hired the company he worked for. And since Zanfretta knew the cottage was unoccupied that night, he immediately suspected the 4 lights were that of flashlights being carried by intruders. So he jumped into action. He pulled out his revolver and began to move towards the lights. He quietly slipped through the open gate and crept along a rock wall, and as he got close enough to jump out on the would-be burglars, he felt a touch on his shoulder from behind. He quickly spun around with his revolver, but he could never be prepared for what he's seen next. There in front of him was this ugly green being staring right at him. He was a giant too, close to 10 feet tall, and had yellow triangular eyes with big thorn-like appendages growing out of the side of his head. He also had clawed feet, and most suspiciously, his skin appeared as if it was pretty fat, or like he was wearing a rumpled suit. But that wasn't the worst of it. There were 4 of these things, not just one. Their mouths looked like they were made of iron, and they had red veins on their heads and pointed ears and arms. Finally, he noted a breathing apparatus being worn over their mouths, suggesting they didn't breathe oxygen. Zanfretta would do like anyone, and he got the heck out of there, running as fast as he could back to his car. But as he was running, he peeked over his shoulder to see this massive triangle-shaped aircraft, although it was hard to make out with the light blinding him. So he held up his hands to block as much light as possible and seen a huge UFO, which he claimed was even bigger than the house. It began lifting up from the backyard of the home, making a hissing sound in the process. Zanfretta was then hit with a wave of heat, but he continued to run to the car, finally making it and jumping inside. He quickly grabbed the car's radio and called the security company radio operator at 12:15 a.m., a Carlo Tuccolino, who would later testify that Zanfretta was speaking in a confused and agitated fashion, so much so that he could only discern so much of it, because it mostly sounded like Zanfretta was babbling. Although he did hear him describing the beings, Carlo was not sure what was going on, and he asked who was assaulting him, and Zanfretta replied, "No, they aren't men. They aren't men. My God, are they ugly?" And mysteriously, the communication stopped. By now, the supervisor was contacted, a Lieutenant Giovanni Casaba, and he was pretty concerned about what was going on, not only for his employees' sake, but also because they wanted to make sure nothing happened at their client's property, whom I assume was paying quite a hefty sum to hire a private security firm to guard his property. So the lieutenant sent out a patrol car to check on Zanfretta, but because the roads were so bad due to the ice, the patrol car didn't make it for another hour. But when they did arrive, the 2 other guards got out and started searching around the home. They quickly found Zanfretta lying on the frozen ground in front of the home. When he saw them coming, he jumped to his feet, looking terrified, and put his flashlight and gun up to both of his co-workers. Both men would later state Zanfretta did not recognize them, and he refused to lower his weapon. The guards eventually were able to rush him and take his gun away before anyone was harmed, and that's when they made the first odd discovery. Although Zanfretta had been laying on the frozen ground for an hour, he was pretty warm. The guards were actually pretty shook up by the entire thing, and actually called the police to come over to the scene. They would begin searching the area, and soon they found these immense imprints in the backyard. He was about 9 foot in diameter and shaped like horseshoes, and many later speculated he came from the triangular-shaped UFO Zanfretta claimed to have seen, most likely the landing gear. By the next day, the news began to spread, and before long, the local police commander would be questioned about the whole event, and of course, whether Zanfretta was mentally stable. The commander's answer was kind of a surprise. He stated he believed every bit of Zanfretta's testimony and found him to be a clear-thinking man, and curiously enough, the police took it seriously, and they began to question people in the area and found out that an additional 52 witnesses claimed to have seen a bright glaring illumination coming from the direction of the home that night. By this point, the media began to hear about the story, and reporters began showing up in the small town. And unsurprisingly, the coverage varied from being skeptical to outright mocking Zanfretta. Some straight up said he was lying about the entire thing, but there was one reporter, a Reno Di Stefano, who took an interest in the case, and he began to cover it, writing many articles about it. He, for one, could not understand why a respected husband and father, as well as being respected by his peers, would jeopardize his career and reputation to make up such a crazy story. He decided to go talk to him and find out more. He quickly found out that Zanfretta hated his newfound fame, and he hated being recognized in public, and most of all, he hated being known as the man who had this strange encounter. The whole ordeal made him worry about losing his high-paying job and his ability to support his family. He would even tell the reporter he was now constantly getting prank phone calls, which was taking a toll on him, since they called at all times of the day and night. Having said that, he would not take anything back. He stated what he had told was not a lie, and that the events happened as he portrayed them. By the 23rd, 2 weeks later, he had convinced Zanfretta to go be put under hypnosis to try and find out more about what really happened that night. And by this point, Zanfretta thought, what do I have to lose? So he went ahead and done it. During the session, Zanfretta was now able to clearly recall more. He now remembered that not only had he seen these beings, but they had abducted him. Apparently, they transported him onto a hot, luminous location where they examined him and then began interrogating him. They couldn't speak Italian, obviously, but used a strange device to translate between the two. That's when Zanfretta was met with the startling revelation. These beings were from a planet called Titonia, which was located in the third galaxy, and most disturbingly of all, they wanted to talk with mankind and would return in larger numbers. So this is pretty big revelations, right? But at least it was over, and Zanfretta could move on with his life. Except, that's not what happened, because just 3 nights after this hypnosis session, Zanfretta would be driving his patrol car around 11:45 p.m. when he suddenly lost control of the vehicle. He grabbed for the radio and called the station to let them know the car was driving itself, and he was hitting the brakes and trying to steer, but the vehicle continued to roll along through a tunnel out into the fog and up a steep incline. The car then drove about a mile before coming to a jarring stop, one that slammed Zanfretta forward and caused him to hit his head on the steering wheel. And just as he was trying to figure out what was going on, the car became immersed in a white hot light. Zanfretta now called back and strangely seemed pretty calm, stating, "The car has stopped. I saw a bright light. Now I am getting out." And again, his fellow guards would be dispatched, and just like last time, they couldn't make it to him until around 1:10 a.m., finding Zanfretta in a field near a road, and despite the pouring rain, he was dry and warm, but he was also in a state of shock, quivering and weeping. Zanfretta would look up at his 2 co-workers and state, "They say I must leave with them. What about my children? I don't want to. I don't want to." This shook the men up, and they promptly called the police, who arrived and began their own investigation, and they found out something odd almost immediately. Even though it was cold and rainy, one of the officers happened to touch the top of Zanfretta's Fiat and realized it was very hot, almost as if it had spent hours baking in the sun. So he opened the car door and stuck his head inside to discover it was hot as an oven. If that wasn't weird enough, the police would also see these really huge boot prints that surrounded the vehicle. They were 20 inches long and 8 inches wide. Each print had a distinctive bare spot between the sole and heel. This would actually end up being one of the most critical pieces of physical evidence ever left at a scene of an alleged alien abduction. Next, the detectives would look at Zanfretta's revolver and soon realized he had fired it 5 times, and Zanfretta could not remember whom or what he had shot at. Because of this, and because of the public attention now on the case, authorities wanted an investigation into the whole bizarre saga, and about a week later, on January 3rd, 1979, the data on the case would be put into a file and labeled as Report on the Sighting of Unidentified Flying Objects by Fortunato Zanfretta. It was then forwarded to the court, where it would sit until a decision was made on what should be done next. But unfortunately, no one wanted to touch the case, for obvious reasons. But after a year of kicking it back and forth to different authorities, it was finally picked up by Magistrate Russo, who declared it should be put away and marked as no crime committed. I should also note here that this investigation had actually been carried out by the Carabinieri, which is one of the main law enforcement agencies of Italy. It's kinda like a hybrid agency, maybe the equivalent of the FBI and US Marshal Service with a little mix of National Guard. But why this is important is because it would be revealed that during their correspondence with the Italian Department of the Interior, they had sent 2 telexes just days after, which said the degree of reliability that these events actually occurred was good. Many have pointed to this as being legit proof that something involving extraterrestrials really happened. However, others point out that this was a time when UFO sightings in Italy were already at a fever pitch. It was so crazy that a former member of the parliament asked both Italy's premier and Minister of Defense to address the Congress about their opinion of the sightings. Meanwhile, Zanfretta's employer was becoming concerned by all the publicity, not to mention the mental health of their employee, and they asked a prominent neurologist, a Dr. Giorgio Giannotti, to examine Zanfretta, who found he was perfectly fine. This led to Zanfretta accepting the offer to undergo hypnosis once again, and this time he would be televised, in an effort to prove he was not insane. Zanfretta would go on to give many more details about the night's events, such as being stripped and forced by the abductors to wear a strange helmet, which according to him allowed him to understand their language, but also caused him great pain. He also remembered one of the aliens taking his gun and firing bullets into a panel, probably to see if human weapons could harm them. He then told the hypnotist his fear of having to leave his home and family behind, as the beings wished to take him with them. While this sounds insane, a ton of people in Italy actually watched this interview, but unfortunately for Zanfretta, it had the opposite effect. It only increased the criticism of his account, while skeptics tore him apart. After this, Zanfretta would become a recluse, for about half a year anyways, when on July 30th, 1979, he would be on his motorcycle patrolling yet again, by this time far from the areas where the weird encounters had taken place, and this time, he strangely just vanished. And again, his fellow guards were dispatched to find him, to which they did, after 2 hours of searching, and this time, Zanfretta was on a summit of a nearby mountain. How he got here is unknown, because all of the potential local eyewitnesses in the area stated they had not seen a young guard on a motorcycle. What makes that odd was this was a desolate area with only one road that went up the mountain, and any residents here would have almost had to see him passing through, and would have no doubt heard the motorcycle. Again, Zanfretta would seek help, this time from the International Center of Medical and Psychological Hypnosis, and he actually requested a professor there, a Marco Marchesin, to inject him with sodium pentothal, better known as truth serum. While under its effects, Zanfretta would state he had been lifted from the ground into the alien spaceship via a mysterious green light, which is probably the least strange thing about this whole account. Following the procedure, Professor Marchesin would state that no human could knowingly lie while under sodium pentothal treatment, and he believed it was highly probable Zanfretta actually had these encounters. But unfortunately, for poor old Zanfretta, his nightmare wasn't over, because fast forward 6 months to December 2nd, 1979, and Zanfretta disappeared again in the suburbs. But this time, things would play out a little bit stranger, because as his security co-workers were dispatched to find him once again, the 4 men would have their own strange encounter. They would report a strange cloud-like object floating above them, and then suddenly 2 beams of light seemed to emerge from within that cloud and lit up the patrol cars below. And crazily enough, the vehicle's engines stopped dead in their spot, and the 4 guards got out to see what was going on and spotted the UFO. Apparently, Lieutenant Casaba, whom we mentioned earlier, Zanfretta's supervisor, became so frightened by the whole thing that he took his pistol out and began firing at it. The lights then went off and the UFO left, but Lieutenant Casaba wasn't even the most frightened. That would be one of the other guards, Germano Zanardi, who apparently was traumatized so bad that he went insane, and just a few months later committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. But this still was not the end of all the craziness, because the following day, Zanfretta, whom I'm guessing they found the previous day, was on patrol again when around 9:30 p.m. he got out of his patrol car to get gas. All of a sudden, he heard someone calling out to him from the shadows beside the gas station. Zanfretta reported he was a humanoid with a bald egg-shaped head and was dressed in a checkered suit that included a chest plate made of steel where the shirt should have been. The being ordered Zanfretta to drive his vehicle into a small cloud that was hovering just above the ground, and Zanfretta did as instructed, almost as if he couldn't resist. There, his patrol car levitated within the cloud and was deposited into a huge spacecraft. Once there, the guard was allowed to explore, although the oversized aliens stayed close to him. Zanfretta reported to have seen these large transparent cylinders filled with a weird blue liquid. One of these contained a frog-shaped body, which the aliens thankfully explained was an enemy of their planet. In two of the other cylinders, Zanfretta also seen a large bird-like creature with another humanoid he described as being caveman-like. It was around this time that these beings attempted to give Zanfretta a transparent sphere that apparently held an electrically charged pyramid inside. The aliens claimed that utilizing the sphere would enable the human beings to comprehend who they were and how they live, but Zanfretta refused, stating he had enough of these strange encounters and wished to go back to a normal life. But they insisted he take it and give it to a man named Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a scientist and most notably UFO researcher. However, Zanfretta instead hid the object in the hills near Genoa, which seems awful suspicious. And again, Zanfretta would disappear just 2 months later on Valentine's Day, 1980, and was found in a state of shock and suffering from mild hypothermia. Interestingly, a villager nearby did report seeing a huge radiant mass in the sky just minutes before the rescuers arrived. And again, a hypnotist would be summoned, and this time though, they found Zanfretta did not want to cooperate, although he eventually did, and stated that the aliens spoke an odd unknown language, and when telling the story, his voice became guttural and he uttered cryptic phrases. Things began to wind down after this, thankfully, with Zanfretta vanishing once more in August of that year, but this time, he was found quickly before any aliens could contact him. He would state decades later, though, that the aliens had began to contact him again. In 1984, a book about the case was written, which studied the 2-year-long saga of weirdness, and that brings us to theories. No doubt, it's weird and seems downright ludicrous, but the fact is, over 60 additional witnesses did report strange aerial phenomena in the exact locations and times that Zanfretta allegedly encountered these beings. That is almost absurd, and is kinda difficult to debunk, and even if it was nothing more than an asteroid or the ever so infamous swamp gas, how in the world did Zanfretta manage to be at all these places at each time and then be found under weird circumstances? There's also the investigation by law enforcement in Italy, who were all convinced he was telling the truth and something strange was happening. Likewise, what about all the hypnotists? And there's also a lot that's been made of the professor that administered the truth serum to Zanfretta, and his statement that no one can lie once given that. Well, actually that's not true. Sodium pentothal only works by weakening someone's resolve, and thereby makes them crack under pressure easier, so the person who is administered is more cooperative with interrogators, not to mention the fact that he allegedly got this sphere with the electrically charged pyramid inside that he was supposed to give to Dr. J. Allen Hynek, but instead took it into the woods where he still allegedly used it to contact aliens, absolutely reeks of a hoax, especially since he has never even taken a picture of it. Regardless, it's went down as one of the most famous alien encounter stories in Italy, and one of the most famous in the world. February 27th, 1993, 27-year-old Gary Sudbrink, a captain in the Air Force stationed in San Antonio, Texas, decided to plan a trip going back home, back to where he grew up in Long Island, New York. It would be a chance to see and surprise his family, along with his friends, so he did not bother calling them ahead of time. But when he got to the airport, I imagine his only concern was hoping that it didn't take too long to get on board. That would be the least of his issues, because while standing around waiting to depart, some man approached Gary with a clipboard and asked him his name, how to spell it, and where he was going, along with other personal information. Gary thought this was someone trying to sell him something, so he ignored him and got on the plane. Shortly after, another guy approached Gary, also carrying a clipboard. Andy sat right next to him and began to question him for the same personal information again. So Gary politely asked the man to leave him alone. About that time, the stewardess approached and asked the man with the clipboard if she could see his ticket. When he showed her, she told him he was in the wrong seat and he would have to move, to which he did. However, after the coast was clear, he got up and sat behind Gary, where he continued to prod him for information again, before the stewardess once again asked him to move. This shook Gary up, and who wouldn't be a little concerned after that? So when he landed, he called his landlord back in Texas and asked him to keep an eye on his apartment while he was away. Meanwhile, he took off towards his parents' house, and once he arrived and spent time with them, he decided to call his good friend Mike to surprise him by telling him he was in town. But when he did, Mike replied, "What are you talking about? You already told me yesterday you were coming to New York." Gary, of course, was perplexed, because he knew he hadn't called him, and began discussing it with Mike. And soon they came to the realization that someone had called Mike pretending to be Gary, and Mike swore it was not some kind of practical joke. He was serious. Gary, still bewildered by the man on the flight, just chalked everything up to a weird coincidence. But this is when things got interesting. While Gary was on the phone with Mike, he got another call, which ended up being from an unlisted number. And when Gary answered, a robotic-sounding voice would ask, "Is Gary Sudbrink there? How long are you back from Texas? You are being impersonated by the other voice." The call would be disconnected, but this robot-sounding person called again at 11 p.m., stating, "Keep an eye on the skies," and "near Orion," and the full moon. That's when Gary's father, who was a ufologist, jumped on the call and immediately began speculating about it being extraterrestrial in nature. Another call came in 30 minutes later stating, "Show double from you, keep an eye on the skies," and "beware government interference." After this, Gary's father and uncle were convinced that this was the work of an intergalactic being. He would be followed up on the next night in what would be the longest and strangest call they would receive. This time, the caller stated, "We come to be within this planet," and "government interference, visitations to be disrupted," and ended with the strange phrase, "The sun will rise on the dark side of the moon." Let's take a listen to some of these so you can get a better idea.
Yes. I'll tell you who it is.
Hello?
Yeah. Do you want to speak to him?
Is Gary's Sudbrink there?
Yeah, who's this? Steven? Are you playing games with me or what? Huh? Steven, if you're playing games, I'm going to kick your ass.
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
Huh?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Yeah, this is you, Steven, you idiot. You pissed me off. Jerk. I'm going to get you on... Let's see what it says. Review. One new call out of area. Is Steven out of the area?
How long are you going to be back from Texas?
Wait, say that again?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
So kinda weird, huh? Well, it gets stranger, because Gary's brother Steven would, after all this, be reminded of a separate strange incident that happened about a year prior. Driving down the highway, he looked over to see the same exact model vehicle Gary drove, and soon enough, he seen Gary making faces at him, which made sense because both were en route to a family member's wedding. But when Steven got there and brought it up to Gary about passing him on the highway and him making faces, Gary was stunned, because he had been at the wedding most of the day. Actually, he hadn't been on the road for hours, so just who did Steven see? Now Gary wondered if these calls, and that incident, and the people at the airport were all connected somehow. He wondered if he had a doppelganger, or imposter, or maybe it was the work of some kind of extraterrestrial. Interestingly, Gary is to this day skeptical about the whole thing, and he believes someone pranked him, although he doesn't know who. And he's also stayed low-key about it, not really pushing to have his story out there, so it seems likely he was not the source of the hoax. But what are the theories? The main one seems to be that the whole thing was a prank by Gary's friends in the Air Force. For one, they were well aware of Gary's dad's obsession with UFOs, and they also knew that Gary was visiting New York, which is why they knew the right questions to ask Gary. It suggested They done it by using a handheld cassette player, which they had already recorded various phrases on, and then they played them at a much slower speed, giving it that robot effect, and possibly making it sound like Gary's voice. Of course, this doesn't explain why they abruptly stopped the prank, or never told Gary. Others suggest that Gary's dad or uncle, whom were both ufologists, were behind the whole thing, either as a way to prank Gary, or maybe to try and bring him into the UFO world with them. Of course, they didn't know he was coming in since it was a surprise visit, so I'm not sure how prepared they could have been. Likewise, why didn't they keep trying if that was the case? Nor does this explain the strange guy on the plane or at the airport. Others think that a neighbor or someone that just knew Gary's family, especially his dad and his UFO obsession, decided to prank them. But again, what about the guy at the airport or on the airplane? And finally, the most bizarre theory, Gary had a stalker, maybe one from his everyday life or someone from his past that had a motive to try and make him feel threatened or worried, or just to cause him stress in general.